Nintendeen is already doing damage control. I've kind of neglected talking about Nintendeen over the past several months because this guy is a nobody. His channel isn't going anywhere. He's just some retard on the internet desperately trying to downplay everything Nintendo does by being hyper anal about everything. Like, he's trying to sit there right now and try to tell you that, like, actually, the Switch 1 was outpacing the Switch 2 compared to its numbers in 2017. He's completely neglecting to mention the fact that the Switch 1 had an additional 3 months of the year to sell units. So his entire cope of just in 2017 the Switch 1 sold slightly more. It just doesn't make any sense because the Switch 2 comparatively has been on the market less. So it hasn't been on the market for 9 months. It has been on the market for 6. So his entire coping and seething, trying to downplay the fact that the Switch 2 is doing huge numbers, doing really, really well, is really, really successful. It's all just falling flat, right? We have hard numbers now. We can say definitively that the Nintendo Switch 2 was the best-selling hardware in the US in 2025, so no longer can we do that only in Japan cope. And now we have Nintendeen desperately trying to control the narrative. He's desperately trying to convince you that no, it's still on a downward spiral, guys. You're seeing all this insane cope from these people. They're bending over backwards so hard trying to downplay the Switch 2, and it's so amazing to see. And it does deserve to get called out because the narrative before was that Switch 2 sales completely collapsed in December, that nobody was buying anything, and that the entire video game industry was crashing, right? That was the narrative. But now that we actually have the hardware, we can see that Xbox and PlayStation sales collapsed, but Nintendo Switch 2 sales were perfectly fine. They're perfectly healthy, and they're still in that launch window period where we aren't even through with the first year yet. We're not even close. So Nintendeen is sitting there trying to gaslight you into thinking the Switch 2 is not popular, that people aren't happy with it, that there are no games coming out, and it's just a gigantic cope. It really is a gigantic seed, trying to keep up the grift for as long as possible. The instant we get some clarification as to what the market actually did over the holiday season, he is immediately there trying to damage control it. He is trying to keep up the narrative that the Switch 2 is failing and that there's nothing that Nintendo could possibly do to succeed. It is laughably stupid and should be called out for what it is. It is simply a means to get as many views and as much attention as possible by telling PC gamers and internet trolls what they want to hear. And that really is what Nintendo hit content has always been, right? There's a very dedicated group of people who want to see Nintendo fail. And so people like Nintendeen have always existed. They've always come out and tried to push this narrative that Nintendo is failing, Nintendo is doomed, here's why, let me lay it all out for you. And it's all just a bunch of hogwash. It's all just a bunch of nonsense. I really feel as if this is the generation in which people like Nintendeen will no longer have the sway they did, because I saw plenty of pushback to Nintendeen this generation. I was calling out his nonsense. Other people were it feels like this is going to be the beginning of the end of this business model, because it's no longer believable that a single bad year or month could somehow completely dismantle Nintendo. Back in the day, the narrative was always that Xbox and PlayStation were way bigger companies, and that's why they were going to beat Nintendo. That didn't happen. The third parties were going to ignore Nintendo because they were a kiddie brand. That didn't happen. We've seen all of the giant traditional copes regarding Nintendo just kind of fall apart over the years. Like, remember the censorship thing, remember the horsepower thing, remember all of this, like, and now we just have like people inventing narratives out of whole cloth and then desperately trying to justify them for as long as possible before they collapse. Like, we're at the point now where like all of the major copes don't really last like more than a month, honestly. Like, initially, remember when like Mario Kart World wasn't going to sell well because of the price point? Didn't happen. Now people pretend that like was never a thing to begin with. Remember when the Switch 2 wasn't going to sell because of the price point? Remember when it wasn't like an innovative enough piece of hardware? Remember when they did this? Like, remember when we were told that the Nintendo Switch 2 did not do well over the holiday season in the US, right? That was like the entire the entire basis of like saying Nintendo Switch 2 was failing, right? For like the past month. And now it's done. Like, now we have hard numbers, now it's finished, and like now Nintendeen is desperately trying to keep up the grift and try to keep the narrative negative. And it's just not doable. It's just not possible at this point. Like, the more they try the same tricks, the more people will start to see through them. It's embarrassing. It really is pathetic how these people dedicate their entire lives to like hating Nintendo and obsessing over like their hardware numbers and their sales in a desperate bid to try and convince other men on the internet that like the company is failing, that there's just no hope of recovery, that Nintendo is doomed since 1889. Like, this is a meme for a reason, okay? Like, this is why fans have always felt that like gaming analysts and game journals don't really understand the company or their business model or like their actual appeal, because you see these guys make these statements, they make these grand statements about how like say general audiences will never support Nintendo. They make statements about how the company has no mass appeal. They'll try and tell you that like that's another cope right now. The Switch 2 has no games. Like, and it's such like, even if you like get hyper anal about it and say very specifically like AAA games that are Nintendo Switch 2 exclusives that appeal to the mass market, like they have plenty of those. You know what I mean? It's like every cope they try to introduce just doesn't make any sense. It falls apart. It doesn't hold up under any kind of scrutiny. And like, this idea that the Switch 2 was doing badly over the holiday season, it was something that was made up by a game journal that was trying to push an agenda. He had no real numbers. He had no real information. Like, he just pulled something out of his ass. Okay, and that's what the entire Nintendo hate community is at its core. If you look at these Nintendo hate channels, if you look at the conspiracies, if you look at what these people do and what they say, like, they never really have a source for anything. It's all just this incredibly hyperbolic, fake nonsense. And it's high time that we start blacklisting people for these kind of statements. So, like, yeah, I'd like to come out and, like, blacklist people like, okay, the Harmon Smith blacklist. Stephen Toto for complaining about the stock market crash. By the way, Ubisoft lost like 30% in a day today because they're a failing company. Good luck getting anyone to talk about that. I'm blacklisting Stephen Toto because of the stock price thing. I'm blacklisting Christopher Dring for trying to say the Switch 2 was failing in the UK. And I'm blacklisting Nintendeen for being a complete fucking retard who's not even fun to listen to. Like, imagine making 30-minute long videos every day trying to tell people that to ignore their eyes and ears and ignore all the evidence of like the Nintendo Switch 2 success. You can watch any Nintendeen video and he's just sitting there talking about how like Nintendo is doomed, guys, and here's why. And then he just kind of like he just tries to say that like that the company is just bad and that everybody hates them. It's just a giant cope. I don't want to hear it anymore. Nintendeen is going on the blacklist.